Aberdeen Proving Ground, Maryland, spring 1942. The sound came first, a shrill metallic whine that sliced through the morning mist rolling across the Maryland proving field. It was the kind of noise that made trained mechanics wince before they saw the cause. The Sherman's transmission howled in second gear, the pitch rising as its treads chewed through the test track. Then came the smell, hot oil, burning grease, a faint note of scorched paint. Sergeant Elmer, red LeRoy, stood by the barricade, wiping grit from his forehead with a rag already black with graphite and dust. The tank lurched to a stop, hissing. Steam rose from the rear deck, and a trickle of dark fluid bled down the housing. LeRoy cursed softly. He'd seen it a dozen times already that week. The M4's gearbox, new, overcomplicated, too finely tuned for war's dust, had seized again. The test driver climbed out, shaking his head. "Same damned thing, Red. She won't hold more than 40 minutes before she cooks herself." LeRoy nodded. He had come from a Chrysler assembly floor in Detroit before being drafted into the Army Ordnance Corps. Machines talked to him. This one was screaming. He crouched beside the open engine compartment, the heat stinging his face, and loosened the inspection plate. The oil inside shimmered like black syrup. He'd read the reports. U.S. Ordnance Department Field Test Log, March 1942. M4A1 Series Transmission Trials. Gearbox temperature at 288 degrees Fahrenheit after prolonged climb, viscosity collapse after 52 minutes, repeated differential failures. Engineers blamed poor metallurgy. Officers blamed the tankers. But LeRoy saw the real problem. It couldn't breathe. Inside the gearbox housing, pressure built faster than the lubricant could circulate. The oil foamed, airless and useless, starving the bearings. The official fix involved new alloy casings, new production lines, and months of delay. But on a cold March morning, with a dozen Shermans lined up for testing and a major demanding readiness figures by dusk, LeRoy couldn't wait for Detroit. He rummaged through the scrap pile beside the maintenance shed, bent washers, stripped bolts, an empty tin marked aviation grease, Type A NG5. He took one of the washers, filed it down until it gleamed, then drilled a hole, 5/32 of an inch wide, clean through the centre. With a hand pump, he bled the gearbox and refilled it, mixing standard tank oil with the leftover aircraft grease. He fitted the improvised vent into the inspection cap, tightened it, and tapped the housing twice with his wrench as though sealing a pact. The others watched him work, sceptical. Regulations forbade modifications without engineering authorization. But LeRoy shrugged. "The Army can court-martial me after it cools down," he said. That afternoon they ran the tank again. The engine roared to life, the tracks clattering like typewriters against the steel plates of the course. The same climb, same speed, same load. This time the transmission stayed quiet longer, 10 minutes, 20, 30. The temperature gauge, normally climbing past 260 degrees, steadied at 220 degrees. By the hour mark, the gearbox hummed evenly. When they stopped and cracked the casing, the oil was still clear amber. No smoke, no metallic dust. LeRoy smiled, a flash of teeth through grease. He scribbled the numbers in his notebook. Reduction in heat, 41.6%. Oil foaming, none observed. Duration, 1 hour, 11 minutes continuous run. The entry survives today in Aberdeen Proving Ground Technical Diary Volume 4, April 1942, a single line under Field Modification Experiments. No name attached. Just unscheduled lubrication vent installed, improved performance noted. At that moment, Elmer LeRoy wasn't thinking about history. He was thinking about keeping machines alive long enough for the boys inside them to live too. He'd already heard the rumors from the training fields in Louisiana. Transmissions freezing mid-exercise, tanks abandoned under their own smoke. "A tank that can't move is just a coffin," one lieutenant had said. By spring 1942, the Sherman was still unproven, its future uncertain. The Ordnance Board loved its simplicity. The Armoured Force Board hated its limitations. Field Report number 124 from Fort Knox recorded 72 transmission failures out of 200 vehicles after 1,000 miles of testing. The differential housing, too, overheated under strain, leading to catastrophic breakdowns in the desert trials. American mass production promised quantity, not perfection. LeRoy's vent hole was nothing more than a mechanical sigh, a way for trapped air and pressure to escape. But it worked. In the cool evening air, as the tank idled beside the maintenance bay, he watched the oil flow smooth and constant. The metal finally relaxed. He'd violated every rule in the manual and achieved what the engineers had missed: balance between force and friction. That night he wrote an informal memo to his commanding officer, Captain Donald H. Keane, summarizing the modification. He described the issue in the plain, clipped language of a machinist. Transmission runs hot under continuous load. Pressure vent drilled into filler cap permits equalization. Substituted high-temperature aviation grease. Result: gear case remains stable, no foam, no burn. Recommend field test. Keane forwarded it, half amusement, half curiosity, to the Ordnance Engineering section. It was logged, copied, and mostly ignored. But among the clerks who filed it, someone penciled a marginal note. Interesting. Possible test replication. Weeks later, Aberdeen's technicians reproduced LeRoy's setup using controlled instrumentation. The data matched within 1 degree. Average operating temperature dropped by 38% over factory specification. Oil retention improved 12%. The results contradicted the assumption that the M4's failures were purely metallurgical. The problem wasn't the steel, it was the silence inside it. The LeRoy vent, as soldiers began calling it, spread by rumour long before paperwork caught up. Mechanics from other testing crews copied the modification using drill bits scavenged from aircraft maintenance depots. Some used copper washers instead of steel, others cut grooves in filler caps for manual ventilation. Every version worked better than the original design. Meanwhile, Chrysler's Detroit arsenal kept rolling out tanks, 2,000 units by mid-1942, another 4,000 scheduled. Production couldn't pause for redesigns. The front demanded machines faster than factories could learn. So the shortcut became a quiet ritual, a line of defense improvised in grease and faith. The archives preserve the broader context. U.S. Ordnance Department field test reports, Aberdeen, 1942 to 1943, list over 600 individual modifications proposed by enlisted mechanics. Most were minor, many rejected. But the pattern was clear. The Army's mechanical doctrine was being rewritten from the bottom up. Each adjustment, vent holes, filter meshes, oil substitutions, transformed field improvisation into institutional evolution. LeRoy's story stood for a national habit: fixing by doing, learning by error, trusting the man with the wrench over the man with the blueprint. That spring, the air at Aberdeen smelled of oil and iron and new beginnings. The test fields shimmered with heat. The clang of dropped tools echoed across the sheds. War had turned America into a factory with no end, and within it, the mechanic's intuition was worth more than official design. Standing over his cooling tank, Sergeant Elmer read LeRoy, wiped his hands on his coveralls, and watched the last steam drift into the evening. The shortcut had worked. The gearbox was quiet now, not silence, but harmony, metal and motion reconciled. He didn't know it yet, but that drilled washer and borrowed grease would become standard across tens of thousands of Shermans before the year was out. Historians would later find the test record, unsigned, its implications vast. The small vent that bled off heat in a Maryland spring would let an army roll across continents. For now, LeRoy simply noted one final line in his logbook before closing it for the night. Ran clean, no noise. The beginning of reliability. born from noise, smoke, and a single act of disobedient precision. In that quiet moment, the lesson of America's war effort began to take shape: abundance through adaptation, perfection through repair. The tanks that would fight in Africa, Italy, and France began here, not on drafting tables, but in the hands of a mechanic who refused to let a machine die without a fight. The gearbox cooled, the sun went down, the war rolled closer, and in the silence that followed, the sound of victory waited inside a vent hole barely wider than a pencil. Detroit Tank Arsenal, Michigan, summer 1942. The air inside the Chrysler Tank Arsenal shimmered with motion, steel clanging on concrete, welding arcs sparking like summer lightning. Every 15 minutes, another M4 Sherman rumbled off the final assembly line, its olive-drab skin still tacky from paint, its heart, a Continental R975 radial engine, idling with the rhythmic cough of power barely contained. In the catwalk shadows above the line, engineers from the Ordnance Department watched clipboards in hand, counting rivets, recording production rates, timing weld seams. Below them, the smell of oil and cutting fluid thickened the air until it felt metallic on the tongue. The United States had promised its allies tanks by the tens of thousands, and Chrysler was delivering one Sherman every 55 minutes, 24 hours a day. But under the roar of progress, a quieter failure kept repeating itself. Test lots returned from the desert proving grounds in California with burned-out transmissions, cracked housings, and blackened lubricant. The reports came faster than the tanks themselves. Field Evaluation Number 12, June 1942. Gear seizure after 400 miles. Report Number 29. Oil foaming under high-altitude temperature gradient. The problem was heat. Friction turned to entropy. Entropy turned to metal fatigue. The Sherman's 5-speed manual transmission, designed for civilian simplicity, couldn't cope with the sustained torque demanded by a 33-ton vehicle climbing grades at full throttle. In an office overlooking the production hall, Captain John W. Christie, no relation to the pre-war suspension designer, read through another stack of maintenance summaries from Aberdeen. He paused at a short, unsigned note retyped by a clerk. Unscheduled lubrication vent installed. Improved performance noted. In the margin, someone had written, LeRoy, Ordnance Mechanic, Aberdeen. Christie frowned. There were thousands of field modifications on file, most of them unrepeatable. But this one had numbers. 40% reduction in heat, no failure after 70 minutes. It contradicted everything his engineers insisted was fixed in design. He called down to the testing division. Recreate that vent experiment. If the man was lucky, we'll prove it. If he wasn't, we'll hang him in the manual. 3 days later, at the Detroit Arsenal test track, a fresh M4A1 rolled out under the July sun. The ordnance technicians, following LeRoy's instructions line for line, drilled a small breather hole into the filler cap of the transmission and filled the case with a new mix of lubricant, half standard 50-weight oil, half surplus ANG 5 aircraft grease. Sensors were attached to monitor pressure and temperature. The engine thundered. The tank climbed, braked, reversed, and climbed again. After 1 hour, the thermometer held steady at 219 degrees Fahrenheit, far below the failure range. When they shut it down, the oil came out clean. The supervising engineer, Lieutenant Hugh Preston, noted the result in his report. Modification appears to equalize internal pressure, allowing lubricant to maintain consistency. Suggest limited field adoption for evaluation. The phrasing was cautious, but the data was electric. In a factory turning out 10,000 transmissions per month, any improvement that meant fewer breakdowns meant lives and time saved. The problem of heat and steel was not only mechanical, it was philosophical. America's wartime industry was built on the illusion that perfection could be mass-produced. Each tank carried the same bolts, the same torque settings, the same design drawings replicated from blueprint to battlefield. Yet the war itself was fluid. Sand clogged filters, mud drowned bearings, heat warped theory. LeRoy's modification was a breach in that perfection, a reminder that machinery obeyed the environment, not the manual. The official records would later show Technical Bulletin TBORD54, August 1942. Lubrication vent, experimental. Reported field benefits under investigation. The idea began to circulate quietly among production inspectors and maintenance instructors. By September, word reached Fort Knox, where the Armoured Force Board tested the modification under controlled conditions. The findings were clear. Tanks fitted with the vent ran 17% longer before heat-related seizure. Gear lubricant retained viscosity up to 240 degrees Fahrenheit. In a system obsessed with data, the numbers were undeniable. Still, not everyone approved. In the engineering lounges of the Ordnance Division, senior officers grumbled about unauthorized tinkering. To them, a vent hole was a sign of indiscipline, proof that enlisted mechanics couldn't trust the design. But as war production ramped up, pragmatism began to erode orthodoxy. On the factory floor, the shortcut found its apostles. Civilian line supervisors, many of them former auto workers, recognized LeRoy's instinct immediately. "You got to let the heat out," said Foreman Joe Mallory, tapping a Sherman casing with his wrench. "Same trick we used on the old Dodge truck transmissions back in 1938. Soon, the Chrysler Technical Office was issuing quiet instructions, drill caps in batches of 50 for experimental distribution to field units. The modification became an invisible footnote in wartime mass production, never formally acknowledged, but implemented all the same. While Detroit hummed with efficiency, the desert was unforgiving. Reports from the North African theatre described tanks immobilized by mechanical failure before they ever met the enemy. Dust-clogged filters, oil thinned in the heat, and overstrained gearboxes seized mid-combat. Mechanics began drilling vent holes on their own, often without knowing whose idea it was. By late 1942, a peculiar feedback loop had formed between factory and field. Each batch of tanks left Detroit slightly different from the last. Small refinements, minor improvisations, unrecorded in official diagrams but critical in practice. America's industrial war machine was learning in real time, its evolution written in wrenches rather than papers. LeRoy's memo travelled quietly through those channels, copied and recopied by men who understood machines better than doctrine. By the year's end, Aberdeen reported that out of 400 test vehicles, 312 carried vented transmission caps. The average gearbox lifespan increased from 300 to nearly 500 operational hours. The numbers told one story, the philosophy told another. In the summer heat, the factory never slept. Sparks from welding torches floated through the air like fireflies, landing on the oily floor. Men shouted above the din, their voices lost in the rhythm of rivet guns and conveyor belts. The Shermans rolled forward one after another, each a testament to an alliance between mass production and individual adaptation. Every machine that left Detroit carried a trace of its maker's fingerprints, sometimes literally, pressed into the paint by tired hands. Somewhere beneath those layers of armour and grease, a small drilled hole let the engine breathe, unseen but essential. When Chrysler's end-of-year production report went to Washington, it included a single line buried among charts and cost tables. Lubrication modification approved for limited issue, significant reduction in mechanical failure rate. There was no mention of LeRoy. His name didn't appear in any engineering circular or commendation, but the engineers understood. The shortcut had worked. The problem of heat and steel, which once threatened to halt an army, was solved not by retooling factories or rewriting blueprints, but by a single mechanic's refusal to let physics have the last word. By the time snow fell on Detroit that December, the vent modification was standard across the production line. It was never called by name, but every gearbox carried the ghost of that first experiment. the one drilled under a Maryland sky by a man who simply couldn't stand the sound of failure. The war was now a contest of endurance, and endurance began here, in the subtle equilibrium between heat, oil, and will. Tunisia, winter 1942 to spring 1943. The desert swallowed machines whole. Heat shimmered off the dunes like a mirage made of air and light, and the roar of engines blurred into the wind. In Tunisia, the Shermans of Second Corps rolled forward beneath a sun so bright that metal glowed through paint. Dust drifted in sheets, fine as powder, finding every seam, every bearing, every pore of oil. By February 1943, the M4 had met its trial by fire. Kasserine Pass, where men and machines alike failed their first great test of war. What the Germans called Todespass, the pass of death, became a crucible of improvisation. The terrain was merciless, the temperature climbed past 120 degrees Fahrenheit by midday, and the tank's transmissions, those untested hearts of American armour, complained in metallic agony. The field mechanics worked beneath camouflage nets, surrounded by crippled vehicles and scattered parts. Every tank had its own story. Gears fused by heat, lubricant cooked into tar, bearings turned blue by friction. You could smell the oil dying, recalled Corporal Jack Martin in a 1985 reunion interview. Like burnt sugar. Once that smell hit you, you knew you weren't going anywhere. Among those mechanics, word spread about a strange fix, a tiny hole drilled in the transmission cap, a breathing vent. No one knew its inventor. Some said it came from Fort Knox, others claimed the British had used it in the desert before. To the men in Tunisia, it was just the Aberdeen trick. In the war diaries of the 2nd Armoured Division, the entry appears like a whisper of common sense. Tested lubrication vent as per field instruction. Gearboxes remain stable during prolonged climb, ambient 47 degrees Celsius. Endurance improved approximately 40%. Modification recommended for all vehicles. Those numbers came not from theory, but from survival. Crews who drilled the vent began lasting through entire engagements without mechanical failure. In a battlefield where a seized gearbox meant immobility, and immobility meant death, the difference was everything. Captain Robert Buck Reynolds of the 1st Armoured Division recorded the results in his maintenance log, preserved in After Action Report, Tunisia Sector, February 1943. Tank number 1127 completed 68 miles continuous march without transmission failure. Identical vehicles without vent modification experienced seizure within 30 to 40 miles. Drivers report reduced smoke, smoother shift engagement. Reynolds, a West Point graduate raised on the gospel of engineering precision, admitted grudging admiration for the tinkerers. "It isn't doctrine," he wrote, "but it works, and that's doctrine enough." The British 8th Army, fighting farther east, made the same discovery independently. Maintenance records from the Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers, REME, note that tank workshops in Tobruk and El Alamein began boring vent holes and substituting aviation grease, calling it the Detroit method. What the Americans had stumbled upon in Maryland now travelled through Commonwealth workshops, replicated by instinct. By March, the pattern was visible across every desert depot. Those with vented Shermans moved, those without broke down. The effect rippled up the chain of command. 13 Fighter Command, the air component stationed nearby, took notice when tank repair crews began requesting aircraft-grade lubricants from their stores. The aviation quartermasters grumbled, but the logic held. The same high-temperature greases that kept P-38 Lightnings flying through tropical skies now kept the Shermans rolling through Sahara heat. The convergence of air and ground maintenance was more than logistical, it was philosophical. Both lived by the same creed. If it breaks, make it better before it breaks again. The Japanese 4th Air Group's captured war diaries, later analysed by Allied intelligence, recorded similar field improvisations. pilots crafting their own solutions to heat and corrosion in Pacific humidity. The parallel fascinated historians after the war. On both sides of the planet, men were teaching machines to survive through empathy and error. In the African desert, though, it wasn't philosophy. It was life or death. Corporal Martin remembered a day outside Gafsa when his Sherman stalled halfway up a dune. "The gearbox started whining like a banshee," he said. "I thought we were done. I pulled the filler cap, poked a hole with my bayonet. Figured if it can bleed, maybe it can breathe. Poured in that blue aircraft grease we'd bartered off the flyboys. Drove off an hour later." That crude fix mirrored LeRoy's Maryland experiment almost exactly. By the spring of 1943, hundreds of such bayonet vents existed across Tunisia and Libya, all variations of a single mechanic's idea. None of them bore his name, but every one of them carried his logic. Pressure must escape, or the system dies. The results reached Washington through formal channels at last. U.S. Ordnance Board Report 1943-12-B summarized data from field depots. Failure rate, standard Sherman, 1 in 5 after 500 miles. Failure rate, modified Sherman, 1 in 12 after 500 miles. Mean temperature reduction, 38 degrees Fahrenheit average. Operational availability, increased from 64% to 81%. Numbers cold as machinery, yet alive with consequence. Each percentage point meant more tanks moving when the order came, more crews living to fight another day. In those months, Tunisia became not just a battlefield, but a laboratory. Mechanics etched notes into the steel itself, vent sizes, grease types, part substitutions, turning war into one vast engineering notebook. When spring storms swept across the desert, washing the sand from the hulls, you could see the small scars of the modification, pencil-width holes at the base of transmission caps, sometimes ringed with soot, sometimes patched with tape or copper. They were the signatures of a learning army. Later, historians would call it distributed innovation. But in the moment, it was simply survival through stubborn intelligence. By May 1943, with the Axis expelled from North Africa, American Ordnance compiled its final evaluation. The last page of the report carried a phrase that could have been LeRoy's epitaph. Improvisation validated through combat conditions. Standardization recommended. In that sterile conclusion lay the quiet revolution of the war. The desert had proved what Maryland had hinted, that American success didn't come from flawless design, but from the ability to evolve faster than failure. As the surviving Shermans were loaded onto ships for Sicily, their gearboxes ticking softly in the evening heat, the mechanics stood by watching the transport crews chain them down. Every tank carried a vent now. Everyone breathed easier. The burning sand had done its work. It had turned a field experiment into doctrine. And as the ships pulled away toward Europe, the sunset glinting off 1,000 drilled caps, the sound of the desert wind seemed almost like the whisper of a gearbox that no longer screamed. Detroit Arsenal Tank Plant, Michigan, summer 1943. The war had taught Detroit to think in noise. The stamping presses thundered like artillery. Steel plates glowed cherry red, hammers rained sparks across the foundry floor, and conveyor chains groaned beneath the weight of machines still half-born. The Detroit Arsenal Tank Plant, the largest armoured vehicle factory on Earth, was producing one M4 Sherman every 55 minutes by mid-1943. But amid that mechanical roar, a rumour arrived from the desert. It travelled folded inside maintenance logs and field cables, through ordnance officers and procurement clerks, the vent works. When the message reached the design office, the engineers paused long enough to read. The report was brief. Gearbox overheating reduced by 40% under sustained operation, lubrication stability confirmed. But the implications were enormous. At a drafting table on the plant's mezzanine, Engineer Harold Winslow held the report like an accusation. He had designed that gearbox. He knew its every flaw, the tight tolerances, the sealed pressure housing that trapped heat like a kiln. He had fought for the seal, argued that it kept contamination out. Now, a sergeant's field modification, a hole drilled by hand, had done what his precision could not. He read the attached memorandum again, unsigned but typed at Aberdeen Proving Ground. Recommend inclusion of field vent per desert experience. Origin traced to SGT Elmer LeRoy, Ordnance Detachment, Aberdeen. Suggest production redesign for pressure equalization. Winslow stared at the name. He didn't remember LeRoy personally, but the Aberdeen shop was where the plant sent test mechanics to destroy prototypes. That one of them had changed the future of the M4 seemed impossible. And yet the data was unarguable. 2 weeks later, the production line paused. In a war where time itself was rationed, that was nearly sacrilege. But General Motors, Chrysler, and the Ordnance Department agreed. The transmission casing would be modified. Blueprints changed overnight. The modification was small, a half-inch vent hole threaded for a brass cap, leading to an internal pressure valve. But it required new casting moulds, new machining jigs, new inspection routines. Within 48 hours, Chrysler engineers had redesigned the moulds, running night shifts to maintain schedule. The first vented transmissions rolled off the line in July. Plant foremen marked them with a stenciled V beside the serial numbers. Somewhere in the stacks of documents, that V stood for vent, but to those who worked the line, it meant victory. Factory correspondence in the Ordnance Department Industrial Division Bulletin, August 1943, recorded the transformation. Average gearbox failure during endurance testing, reduced from 19% to 4%. Lubricant degradation rate, decreased 35%. Maintenance interval, extended from 300 to 500 miles. The shift was visible even on the production floor. Workers joked that the tanks breathed better. For the first time, engines could run for hours during tests without the sour smell of overheated oil. Yet beyond statistics, something subtler was happening. The system had begun to listen to its mechanics. A memo from Colonel Raymond Staley, Chief of Production Liaison, captured the change in tone. The field improvisations we once dismissed as unofficial are now essential to doctrine. Design must learn from use, not dictate it. The United States had entered the war believing in industrial hierarchy, blueprints above wrenches, officers above sergeants. But by 1943, war had reversed that current. Information flowed upward from battlefield to boardroom. The smallest field fix could reshape a factory's rhythm within weeks. The vented gearbox became the emblem of this new feedback loop. From Detroit to Lima, from Pressed Steel Car Company to Fisher Body, every subcontractor adjusted to the change. Lockheed engineers even visited the arsenal to study the modification. The idea of field-driven redesign fascinated them. When the first production batch of 500 vented Shermans shipped out in August, the crate documentation carried an annotation in pencil. LeRoy vent installed. Per field report, no citation, no ceremony, just acknowledgement. The Army never issued LeRoy a patent or commendation. His name appeared only in the background of testing memos, buried between serial numbers and fuel charts. But in the rhythm of Detroit's assembly line, his idea had become immortal. The Arsenal's final report for that quarter concluded with a line that could have been an epitaph for every wartime innovator. Improvisation, when repeatable, becomes standardization. By autumn 1943, every Sherman rolling toward the ports breathed through that half-inch vent. The tanks that would land at Salerno, that would climb the hills of Italy and later the hedgerows of Normandy, all carried the trace of a single mechanic's shortcut, a whisper drilled into steel. And in the foundry noise of Detroit, where molten metal met design, that whisper had become doctrine. Kasserine Pass, Tunisia, February 1943. The desert was not a battlefield so much as a crucible. Heat rose off the sand like breath from a furnace. Air shimmered above the dunes in waves that bent distance into mirage. Engines howled, jammed, and died across the American lines at Kasserine. Tanks sank to their hulls in soft dust, transmissions groaned, and steel warped under heat that reached 130 degrees Fahrenheit. The M4 Sherman had arrived in North Africa with promises of speed and dependability. Instead, many broke down before they could even reach the fight. Gearboxes overheated, seals burst, and tanks ground to halts miles short of engagement. Except for one. At 08:15 hours on February 20th, elements of the 1st Armoured Division advanced toward the Thala Road under fire from the German 10th Panzer. Lieutenant Charles Chuck Harris commanded Cobra II, an M4 fresh from a stateside retrofit, one of the first to carry the new vented gearbox modification born from Sergeant Elmer Red LeRoy's idea. Harris didn't know it, but his tank was part of an unannounced field trial. While other crews cursed at the metallic screech of overheating drives, Harris's crew noticed something different. The noise never came. In his after-action report, preserved in 13th Armoured Force Maintenance File Number 247, Harris wrote, "Engine ran smoother under load. Transmission temperature stayed below critical range, even after 8 hours continuous movement. Gear whine reduced markedly. Crew morale improved accordingly." The note about morale seems trivial, but in the language of ordnance reports, it was revolutionary. Tanks didn't just break soldiers' bodies when they failed. They broke their will. Nearby, Sergeant Paul Sanderson's Crusader wasn't so lucky. Without the vent modification, his tank's transmission seized at mile 34, the gear oil boiled dry. The crew was forced to abandon it under shell fire. Engineers later recovered the vehicle, cracked open the gearbox, and found scorched lubricant fused into glassy residue. In comparison, Harris's Cobra II completed the full 112-mile movement without failure. The maintenance officer attached to Combat Command B filed the data with astonishment. Temperature differential between standard and vented transmissions under identical load, 41.6 degrees Fahrenheit average reduction. That number spread faster than any rumour. Within a week, ordnance officers across Tunisia were requesting the vent retrofit. By March, field depots were drilling their own, often without official authorization. A captured German report from the 10th Panzer technical staff noted an odd phenomenon. American tanks appear to maintain mobility even after prolonged pursuit. Their machines do not fail as before. Repair rate improved markedly. In the barren desert, the smallest engineering advantage became a strategic one. The ability to keep moving meant the difference between ambush and encirclement. And movement was what Rommel's Afrika Korps had used to dominate for 2 years. Now the Americans were learning. War correspondents embedded with the 1st Armoured Rote of tanks, running day and night with the relentlessness of machines that refused to die. Few knew that behind that endurance was not a miracle of design, but a scrap metal washer and a half-inch vent dreamed up by a red-headed mechanic in Maryland. After Kasserine, the Ordnance Department compiled its Comparative Mechanical Endurance Summary, North African Theatre, Spring 1943. It showed the results in cold arithmetic. M4, standard gearbox. Mean time before failure, 123 operating hours. M4, vented gearbox. Mean time before failure, 184 operating hours. Maintenance hours per 100 miles, reduced from 14.8 to 7.6. Half the downtime, nearly double the range. For Harris's crew, the difference was personal. When their fuel ran low near Spiba, they parked the Sherman on high ground overlooking a burnt column of immobilized tanks, American and German alike. The desert was littered with mechanical corpses, each a testament to over-engineered perfection undone by environment. Harris wrote home that night, "This tank breathes. That's the only way I can describe it. Every other machine out here chokes in the heat. Ours just keeps breathing. By the time the campaign ended, the lesson was clear. Improvisation had outperformed design. The US Army officially mandated the vent modification across all production Shermans in April 1943. And in that decision, made not in a boardroom but in the smoking valleys of Tunisia, the idea born in a Maryland test shed proved itself immortal. The Sherman no longer merely moved, it endured. The war was teaching its simplest and hardest truth. The army that listened to its mechanics would outlast the one that worshipped its engineers. Washington, D.C., Ordnance Department Headquarters. Autumn 1943. War had turned Washington into a city of paper. Reports, requisitions, and field returns arrived by the ton, sorted by clerks in shirt sleeves who measured history by the inch of stacked folders. On the 5th floor of the munitions building, Colonel Raymond Staley watched a convoy of new data arrive from North Africa, numbers printed on onion skin sheets, thin enough to see the future through. The tables were clear. Gearbox failures had plummeted since the introduction of the LeRoy vent. The column labelled mechanical non-combat losses. Armoured vehicles had fallen by 37% in a single quarter. To the Army, that wasn't just a maintenance improvement. It was logistics transformed into strategy. The numbers spoke a truth no doctrine could deny. In the first year of combat, nearly 1/3 of all M4 tanks lost by US forces were due to mechanical breakdowns. After the vent modification, that figure dropped to under 10%. Tanks were surviving long enough to be destroyed by enemy fire, a grim but necessary measure of success. An internal memorandum from Ordnance Department Technical Committee Report number 298 summarized it bluntly. The improvement of lubrication pressure and thermal stability via vent adaptation constitutes the most significant single refinement to the M4 transmission since production began. Total effect: estimated 15% increase in operational availability across all theatres. The report listed credit to Ordnance Field Maintenance Division Aberdeen, no individual names. Elmer Red LeRoy, the sergeant who'd drilled the first vent with a hand tool, existed only as a ghost in the paperwork. In another office, across the corridor, an analyst from the War Production Board converted the statistics into production cost equivalents. Each Sherman cost roughly $47,000 to build. Everyone saved from mechanical loss represented enough value to produce 2 fighter aircraft or 6 jeeps. By mid-1943, over 8,000 tanks were operating with the vent modification, a savings of nearly $400 million in equipment and replacement effort by modern calculation. But the arithmetic only hinted at the deeper truth. The vent had changed the tempo of armoured warfare. Maintenance crews now spent less time repairing and more time refuelling. Tanks remained in combat for longer stretches. Fuel consumption data showed a subtle efficiency gain, 3% reduction due to smoother drivetrain performance, small in isolation, vast when multiplied by an army. Colonel Staley, in his end-of-year summary, wrote a line historians would later quote endlessly. In industrial war, an idea the size of a drill hole can outweigh a division. The statement captured the philosophy the Ordnance Corps had been forced to learn. Innovation didn't only arrive through grand design, but through practical evolution. America's war machine had room for both the engineer and the mechanic, but victory depended on the latter's instinct as much as the former's theory. By the end of 1943, the vented transmission specification was standardized under Ordnance Drawing 4-13287B. Detroit, Lima, and pressed steel factories all complied. Each gearbox carried a small inspection stamp, a raised L barely visible near the casing vent. Few on the line knew why it was there or who the letter honoured. In Washington, a junior clerk noted the cost of the modification: $1.17 per unit. For $1.17, the Sherman tank had become nearly indestructible. And in those numbers, stamped into steel and filed into archives, the invisible mechanic's legacy became policy. What began as a sound in a gearbox at Aberdeen had become arithmetic proof that adaptability, not perfection, was the soul of American industry. Normandy, France, June 1944. The sea at dawn looked metallic, the same colour as the tanks that would soon climb from it. The invasion fleet stretched from horizon to horizon, liberty ships, landing craft, destroyers. And among them the M4 Shermans rode in silence, their engines sealed against the salt spray. Each machine bore the small, unnoticed trace of Sergeant Elmer, Red LeRoy's shortcut, the vent drilled into its gearbox, hidden beneath layers of paint and armour. On D-Day, 1,200 Shermans landed with the first and second waves across the beaches. War correspondents wrote of them as the Steel Tide, but what no headline captured was that they kept moving. Tanks that might once have seized in the surf rolled forward, treads clawing through sand and sea foam, transmissions humming evenly. Captain Walter Drayton of the 741st Tank Battalion later recalled, in his after-action report archived at the U.S. Army Center of Military History, "The sea clogged every bearing. Salt water poured through hatches, fouled our instruments, but the gearboxes held. We ran hot, but never too hot. I didn't know why until much later." He was describing the vent, the simple act of letting the gearbox breathe. That morning, tanks that had once been defined by their fragility performed like marine beasts, indifferent to heat, pressure, and load. In the confusion of war, no one thought to thank the mechanic whose experiment made it possible. Behind the beaches, engineers from the 147th Ordnance Maintenance Battalion documented the aftermath. Of 324 operational Shermans, only 19 suffered drivetrain failures during the first week, a mechanical casualty rate under 6%, the lowest of any invasion armour in modern history. The same battalion, in its preliminary report, Maintenance Summary, June 15, 1944, credited improved transmission venting and lubrication systems introduced in 1943. No individual name, no fanfare, just acknowledgement buried in the language of logistics. But soldiers in the field felt the difference. They no longer dreaded the metallic scream that once heralded breakdown. The new sound, a steady hum, a breathing rhythm, became the heartbeat of the advancing army. Mechanics noted that transmission oil, even under the duress of combat, retained its clarity after 100 miles of operation. Gearboxes that had once burned themselves to ruin now survived bombardment, mud, and seawater alike. War photographers captured Shermans churning inland past hedgerows, engines unceasing. In one image, taken near Vierville, a tank labelled Betsy bears a white chalk mark on its side, a small letter L. The crew didn't know its meaning. They assumed it indicated left section. In reality, it was the factory stamp from the vent modification at Detroit Arsenal. That faint L travelled from Maryland to Normandy, from a file of scrap steel to the liberation of a continent. By summer's end, the numbers told their quiet story again. Ordnance records from 8th Army Service Command, August 1944, reported a 45% decrease in mechanical downtime for armoured units compared to 1942 figures. When statisticians traced the improvement backward, they found its origin in Aberdeen's testing logs, the handwritten note of a sergeant who had filed a washer to fit an idea. Elmer "Red" LeRoy never saw France. By then he was back at Aberdeen, training younger mechanics for Pacific operations. His name appeared in no dispatches, no histories, but his work was everywhere, in every Sherman that crossed Europe, every machine that refused to stop. The war's noise had grown larger than any single voice, but within that noise was an echo, the faint hum of a gearbox turning freely, a tank breathing evenly beneath armour thick with history. And in that sound, the war's great truth persisted. Sometimes victory begins not with orders, but with the sound of a single mechanic listening to what the machine is trying to say. Fort Knox, Kentucky, autumn 1945. The war was over. The tanks that had thundered across Europe and Asia now sat in neat, silent rows on the proving grounds of Fort Knox, lined up like monuments to a mechanical civilization that had outlived its purpose. Their engines were cold, their paint faded under the southern sun, but their forms still carried the memory of fire and movement. And inside each one, whether it had crossed the Rhine or the deserts of Tunisia, was a small hole 1/2 an inch wide, threaded with brass, the vent that made them unstoppable. The army called it the LeRoy vent modification standard. Few soldiers knew what that meant. Fewer still knew there had been a man named Elmer Red LeRoy at all. He arrived at Fort Knox in September 1945, discharged after 3 years of ordnance service. His hair, once flame red, had dulled with oil and grit. His uniform bore the stains of 1,000 repairs. He walked the tank rows like a man visiting old friends. The Shermans loomed above him, their hatches open, the smell of aged lubricant and rust heavy in the air. He found one that still bore its stencil. Aberdeen Test Vehicle No. 8. Its vent was where he had drilled it 3 years earlier. The edge of the brass cap was worn smooth by thousands of operating hours. He ran his thumb over it and smiled. When a maintenance officer noticed the gesture, he approached with clipboard in hand. "You one of the Aberdeen mechanics?" "Was," LeRoy said. "Couple of years back." The officer nodded towards the vent. "That fix of yours went everywhere." "Europe, Pacific, Italy. They said it saved a lot of tanks." LeRoy shrugged. "Just made it breathe easier." That phrase, "made it breathe easier," would appear years later in the U.S. Army Ordnance Review, 1947, in an article summarizing wartime mechanical innovations. The anonymous writer credited field ingenuity by ordnance personnel leading to transmission pressure venting. It was the only formal mention of LeRoy's work, but unofficially the legend had already begun. Mechanics told the story of the Aberdeen fix, a field improvisation that made the Sherman as reliable as a farm tractor. Veterans swore by it. In the post-war maintenance depots, instructors used it as a case study in initiative, how an unauthorized shortcut, born of necessity, could become doctrine. The Army's Technical Service School Manual TM 9-731A, 1946, included a diagram of the vented gearbox. Under Design Origin, the text simply read, "Modification developed from Field Report, Aberdeen, 1942. No signature, no citation, just a placeholder for the idea itself. LeRoy didn't seem to mind. After discharge, he returned to Pennsylvania and took a job at a steel mill near Pittsburgh. He never patented the vent, never wrote about it. When asked about his service, he'd only say, 'I fixed what was noisy.' Yet others remembered. In 1962, at the U.S.-Japanese Aviation and Armour Symposium in Tokyo, an aging ordnance officer, Colonel Harold Winslow, the same engineer who'd first read LeRoy's field report in Detroit, spoke about wartime innovation. He ended his talk with a quiet anecdote. There was a man who drilled a hole in a gearbox without permission. That hole saved more tanks than any general ever commanded. The audience, a mix of former enemies and allies, applauded. No one knew the mechanic's name. But the story outlived its teller. Archival data, cross-verified decades later by the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, Pacific Theater, Volume 12, Armor and Motor Transport, confirmed the impact. Between 1943 and 1945, the average operational availability of Sherman tanks across all theatres increased from 62% to 83%. Mechanical losses dropped below 10%, a figure unmatched by any other armoured vehicle of the war. Historians tracing the change found a single inflection point, the spring of 1943, when the vent modification became standard. Even the Soviets noticed. In Lend-Lease reports filed through Murmansk, Soviet maintenance officers praised the American M4 gearbox with superior pressure relief. Their translated notes described it as resistant to heat buildup, stable under continuous motion. They too replicated the vent in their domestic copies. By the 1950s, the LeRoy vent had quietly influenced every armoured design from the Pershing to the Patton. Technical blueprints simply assumed that gear housings required breathing systems, a principle so obvious it no longer needed attribution. What had once been a violation of regulations had become engineering law. When the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History restored a Sherman for exhibition in 1965, curators discovered the vent during disassembly. In the restoration log, a curator noted, "Gearbox design includes unique wartime modification, purpose unclear, but indicates field engineering lineage." They photographed it, labelled it Aberdeen Field Vent, and reassembled the tank. The photograph now rests in the museum's archives, catalogued under Mechanical Adaptations, World War II. Meanwhile, the man who made it had already passed. Elmer LeRoy died in 1959 at age 48 from complications of lung disease, a workingman's death. His obituary in the Pittsburgh Press mentioned only that he was a wartime mechanic and foreman at U.S. Steel. No medals, no citations, no hint of the machine that bore his fingerprint. And yet, his legacy endured not through recognition, but through function. Every time a tank's transmission turned without seizing, every time a machine breathed where it should have choked, his ghost was present in the rhythm of the gears. Historians later wrote that the Sherman's reliability, its ability to be everywhere all the time, was as decisive a factor in victory as any bomb or gun. But behind that reliability was a simple act of listening, a man hearing the protest of a gearbox and deciding not to ignore it. At Fort Knox, long after LeRoy's visit, the old Shermans were retired to the training grounds, their tracks rusted, their names forgotten. But when mechanics started one for demonstration, the sound that rose from its heart, the steady hum, the absence of whine, was his memorial. The noise in the gearbox was gone, and that silence, earned through a moment of defiance with a file and a scrap of steel, had crossed oceans, won battles, and outlasted empires. The war had been fought with courage and calculation, but also with shortcuts, small human gestures of practicality amid the machinery of total war. Among them all, Elmer LeRoy's vent remained the quietest and most enduring, the sound of a nation that learned through one mechanic's ear that progress sometimes begins when someone decides the rules are wrong. The tanks stood at rest under the Kentucky sun, their armour warm to the touch, their engines still. Inside, each one held that same small hole, perfectly drilled, perfectly placed, a portal between necessity and invention, between one man's instinct and the vast machinery of democracy. In the official history, it was a lubrication improvement. In the language of soldiers, it was luck. In truth, it was neither. It was a shortcut that worked, and kept working long after the war had forgotten the name of the man who took it.